One slap. 1 second. One decision that changed everything. A police officer thought no one would question his power when he struck a young girl in public. But he was. What happened next didn't just shock a city. It destroyed a career and exposed a truth many try to ignore. This is not just a story about violence. It's a story about racism. Watch till the end, because the outcome will surprise you. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, subscribe to the channel so these voices are never silenced again. The afternoon heat pressed down on the city like a heavy hand, turning the busy street into a slow-moving river of noise, impatience, and sweat. Cars idled at the intersection, horns blaring in uneven bursts, while pedestrians wove between food carts and cracked sidewalks, trying to outrun the sun. Near the corner stood a small group of people gathered around a police cruiser, its blue and white paint faded from years of service, its engine still running. At the center of that circle was the girl. She couldn't have been more than 16, slim, dark-skinned, with tightly coiled hair pulled back into a low puff, wearing a plain yellow hoodie that had seen better days and jeans frayed at the hem. Her hands trembled as she clutched the strap of her worn backpack, eyes darting from face to face, searching for something familiar, something safe. She had done nothing more than ask a question, why she was being stopped, why the officer had grabbed her arm so roughly. But her voice, soft and uncertain, seemed to irritate him more than any insult could have. The police officer towered over her, broad-shouldered and red-faced beneath his cap, his jaw clenched tight, as if holding back words he'd been waiting to say his whole career. His name badge caught the sunlight, gleaming sharply, a symbol of authority that demanded obedience without explanation. To him, she was just another problem on the street, another face he had already judged before she ever spoke. The people watching could feel the tension thickening, like the air before a storm. Some slowed their steps but kept their distance, pretending not to stare. Others raised their phones discreetly, instinctively sensing that something was about to go wrong. The girl's heart pounded so loudly she was sure everyone could hear it. She had grown up learning this fear, the way to keep her eyes lowered, her hands visible, her voice calm. But fear did not always protect you, especially when the person in power had already decided who you were. The officer leaned closer, invading her space, his voice sharp and dripping with contempt as he accused her of loitering and talking back, words that felt absurd even as they left his mouth. She tried to explain that she was waiting for her bus, that she had just come from school, that she wasn't doing anything wrong, but every sentence seemed to fuel his anger. The crowd shifted uneasily. A woman across the street whispered, "This isn't right," while a man shook his head, torn between stepping in and staying silent. In that charged moment, the officer's patience snapped, not because the girl posed any threat, but because she dared to question him. His hand moved before his mind caught up, a swift, cruel arc through the air. The slap landed hard against the girl's cheek, the sound cracking through the noise of traffic like a gunshot. Gasps rippled through the crowd. The girl stumbled, shock freezing her in place as pain flared across her face, her eyes wide with disbelief more than hurt. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stop. The officer stood there, chest heaving, as if he had proven something, as if he expected the world to agree with him. But the world did not look away this time. Phones were no longer hidden. They were raised high, recording every second. Whispers turned into angry murmurs. The slap had crossed an invisible line, transforming a routine stop into a public act of brutality. In that instant, neither the officer nor the girl fully understood what had just been set in motion. But the city did. One slap, born of racism and unchecked power, had just changed everything. The silence that followed the slap was heavy, unnatural, as if the city itself had stopped breathing. Then reality rushed back in all at once. Someone shouted, "Hey, you can't do that." Another voice cracked with anger, demanding the officer step back. The girl slowly lifted her hand to her cheek, her fingers shaking as they brushed against the heat and sting spreading across her face. Her eyes filled, but no tears fell, not yet. She had learned long ago that crying in moments like this could be twisted into guilt, weakness, or defiance, depending on who was watching. Instead, she stood frozen, humiliated in front of strangers, her dignity stripped away with the same force as the slap. The officer straightened his posture, adjusting his belt as if nothing extraordinary had happened, as if striking a child in public was just another part of the job. "Back up," he barked at the crowd, his voice loud, commanding, practiced. "Mind your business." But it was already too late for that. Business had become everyone's concern the moment his hand met her face. A middle-aged woman pushed forward, her hands clenched into fists. "She's a kid," she said, her voice trembling with rage. "What is wrong with you?" The officer shot her a warning look, one that had silenced many people before, but it didn't work this time. More phones appeared, held high like shields. A teenager near the bus stop was already live streaming, narrating in a shaky voice, "Yo, this cop just slapped a girl for no reason." The words spread faster than anyone could stop them, carried by the invisible current of the internet. The girl finally found her voice, small but steady. "Why did you hit me?" she asked. It wasn't a challenge. It wasn't an accusation. It was genuine confusion, the kind that comes when your understanding of right and wrong collapses in an instant. The officer scoffed. "Watch your mouth," he snapped. "You were being disrespectful." Disrespectful. The word hung in the air, hollow and absurd. Disrespectful for asking a question. Disrespectful for existing in a space he believed she didn't belong. The girl's knees felt weak, but she forced herself to stay upright. She thought of her mother's warnings, her father's silence whenever police sirens wailed nearby, the unspoken rule that black children learned early. Survival sometimes meant swallowing injustice whole. But swallowing didn't mean forgetting. She could feel the memory of this moment carving itself into her, deep and permanent. Across the street, a man stepped off the curb, his voice calm but firm. "Officer, you need to call your supervisor," he said. "Now." The officer laughed, a short, humorless sound. "I don't need to call anyone," he replied. "I'm handling it." Yet his eyes flicked nervously toward the growing crowd, toward the phones, toward the reality slipping out of his control. He suddenly ordered the girl to sit on the curb, pointing sharply to the ground. For a moment, she hesitated, not out of defiance, but exhaustion. Then she sat, backpack still clutched to her chest like armor. The yellow fabric of her hoodie contrasted painfully with the gray concrete beneath her, a bright, innocent color against a hard, unforgiving surface. The murmurs grew louder, angrier. Someone yelled that they had already called internal affairs. Another person shouted that the news was on its way. The officer's partner, who had been standing near the cruiser, finally intervened, stepping between him and the crowd. "Hey, relax," the partner muttered under his breath, not to the girl, but to the officer. "This is getting messy." Messy. As if what had happened was a spill that could be wiped up, rather than a violation that couldn't be undone. The officer clenched his jaw again, his authority slipping through his fingers. For the first time, uncertainty crept into his expression, not regret, but fear of consequences. The girl stared straight ahead, her mind racing. She wondered if she would be arrested, if she would miss her bus, if her parents would believe her when she told them what happened. She wondered how many times this officer had done something like this before, how many people had stayed silent, how many stories had never been recorded. A tear finally slipped down her cheek, tracing the path of his hand. She wiped it away quickly, lifting her chin. Around her, the city buzzed with outrage now, no longer passive. Strangers had become witnesses, and witnesses were becoming allies. The slap that was meant to put her in her place had instead exposed something far bigger, a system that allowed power to be used without mercy. And as sirens approached in the distance, not for her, but for him, one truth became clear. This moment was no longer just about a girl on a sidewalk. It was about accountability, and it had only just begun. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the growing chaos, sharp and insistent, drawing every head toward the far end of the street. The girl felt her stomach twist as panic surged again. Sirens had never meant help in her experience. Instinctively, her shoulders tensed, and she hugged her backpack closer, as if it could somehow protect her from what came next. The officer noticed her reaction and smirked faintly, mistaking her fear for guilt. To him, those sirens were reinforcements, confirmation that he was still in control. But the crowd sensed a shift. This time, The sirens didn't carry the promise of intimidation. They carried scrutiny. They meant questions, reports, and eyes that couldn't be turned away. A second patrol car pulled up, followed by a supervisor's SUV. Doors opened, radios crackled, and uniformed figures stepped onto the sidewalk, their expressions already serious as they took in the scene. The girl seated on the curb, the swelling red mark on her cheek, the circle of angry onlookers, and the dozens of phones pointed like silent witnesses. The supervising officer, a woman with streaks of gray in her hair and tired lines around her eyes, locked onto the girl first. Her gaze softened just a fraction before she turned sharply toward the officer who had struck her. "What happened here?" she asked, her tone clipped, professional, leaving no room for nonsense. The officer launched into his version immediately, words tumbling out fast and rehearsed. He claimed the girl was being aggressive, that she resisted instructions, that he felt threatened. The girl listened, disbelief washing over her as his lies stacked neatly on top of one another. Aggressive, threatening. The words felt surreal applied to her, 5'3", shaking, still in her school hoodie. The crowd erupted in protest, voices overlapping as people shouted that they had seen everything, that it was a lie, that the slap was unprovoked. The supervisor raised a hand, silencing the noise with authority. "I need statements," she said. "All of you who witnessed this, stay right here." That was when the phones truly changed everything. One by one, people stepped forward, holding out screens glowing with recorded proof. Videos from different angles, different distances, all capturing the same brutal moment. The officer leaning in, the girl speaking, the sudden strike. There was no aggression from her, no threat, just confusion, and then pain. The supervisor watched the footage in silence, her jaw tightening with every replay. The officer's confidence drained visibly, replaced by a tightness around his eyes, a defensive stiffness in his posture. He tried to interrupt, to explain, but she cut him off with a look that said she'd seen enough. "Turn your body cam footage over," she ordered. The officer hesitated for half a second too long. It was a small pause, almost imperceptible, but it screamed louder than any confession. The supervisor noticed. So did everyone else. A low murmur rippled through the crowd as suspicion sharpened into certainty. Another officer retrieved the body cam, docking it without a word. The supervisor exhaled slowly, like someone bracing for impact. "You're going to stand down," she said to him. "Right now." The words landed hard. Stand down. In front of everyone. The officer's face flushed, anger flashing briefly before being smothered by fear. He stepped back, hands clenched at his sides, the badge on his chest suddenly feeling less like a shield and more like a spotlight. Meanwhile, a paramedic knelt in front of the girl, speaking gently, asking permission before examining her cheek. The contrast was stark, care where there had been cruelty, respect where there had been power abuse. The girl nodded, her throat tight, overwhelmed by the sudden attention and concern. The paramedic confirmed the swelling and asked if she felt dizzy. She shook her head, then paused. "I just want to go home," she whispered. The words broke something open in the people listening. Home. Not revenge. Not justice. Just safety. Just peace. As statements were taken, the story began to spread beyond the sidewalk. Notifications buzzed. Comments flooded in. The live stream had already reached thousands, then tens of thousands, each share amplifying the truth. Names were being mentioned now. The officer's name, the department, the location. Accountability was no longer an abstract concept. It was unfolding in real time. Reporters arrived, cameras slung over shoulders, asking questions the officer could no longer avoid. He stood apart, isolated, watching his career unravel frame by frame on glowing screens. The supervisor finally approached the girl, kneeling to meet her eye level. "You did nothing wrong," she said quietly. "I'm sorry this happened to you." The apology wasn't enough. It could never be enough, but it mattered. The girl nodded slowly, absorbing the words, letting them anchor her amid the storm. For the first time since the slap, she felt something other than fear. She felt seen. Behind them, the officer was escorted to the side, no cuffs yet, but the distance was symbolic. He was no longer the authority here. The power had shifted, not because the system suddenly became just, but because the truth had been witnessed too clearly to bury. As dusk began to settle over the street, one fact became undeniable. This was no longer an internal matter, no longer something that could be smoothed over with paperwork and silence. The slap had opened a door, and on the other side waited consequences he could not outrun. By the time the sun dipped lower and cast long shadows across the street, the incident had already escaped the boundaries of that single block. It traveled faster than anyone present could have imagined, through social media feeds, news alerts, and whispered conversations in living rooms miles away. The girl was taken to a nearby station, not as a suspect, but as a witness, though the familiar coldness of the building still made her skin crawl. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, harsh and unforgiving, while she sat wrapped in a thin blanket someone had offered her, the yellow of her hoodie peeking out like a reminder of how ordinary this day had started. Every now and then she touched her cheek, not because it still hurt so badly, but because she needed proof that it had really happened, that it wasn't some nightmare her mind had invented. Outside, reporters clustered behind barricades, microphones thrust forward, voices overlapping as they repeated the same questions. How could this happen? Was this officer known for prior complaints? What would the department do next? The police chief arrived amid flashing lights, his expression carefully neutral, though tension lined his forehead. He spoke in measured tones about investigations and procedures, about taking the matter very seriously, words polished smooth by years of public statements. But the public wasn't satisfied with words anymore. They had seen the video. They had heard the sound of skin against skin, the stunned silence that followed, the collective gasp of a community recognizing injustice when it stared them in the face. Inside the station, the girl gave her statement slowly, carefully, recounting each detail as clearly as she could. Her voice wavered at times, but she did not stop. She described the way the officer grabbed her arm, the way his face twisted with irritation when she asked a simple question, the disbelief she felt just before his hand struck her. An officer typed quietly, nodding, occasionally asking her to repeat something for accuracy. For once, she was being listened to, her words recorded not as suspicion, but as truth. Still, every keystroke felt heavy, like her pain was being translated into something cold and official. Meanwhile, the officer who had slapped her sat alone in a separate room, his confidence fully drained. His badge and weapon had been placed on the table in front of him, stripped away with a formality that felt almost ceremonial. He stared at them as if they belonged to someone else, someone he used to be. His phone buzzed incessantly, missed calls from colleagues, frantic messages from family, notifications he was too afraid to open. He had always believed the uniform would protect him, that the system would bend to cover its own. But as he replayed the footage in his mind, he knew there was no angle, no report, no excuse that could erase what had been caught so clearly. Back on the street, a small crowd still lingered, refusing to let the moment fade quietly. Candles appeared on the sidewalk where the girl had been slapped, their flames flickering against the concrete. Someone taped a handwritten sign to a lamppost. She asked a question. He used violence. Strangers stood shoulder to shoulder, united by anger and grief that felt both fresh and familiar. For many of them, this wasn't just about one girl or one officer. It was about every story that never made the news, every video that was deleted, every voice that was ignored. At home, the girl's parents watched the footage for the first time, their hearts breaking in ways words couldn't fully capture. Her mother covered her mouth, tears spilling freely, while her father stared at the screen in silence, his hands clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Rage, fear, and helplessness tangled inside him, but beneath it all was a fierce determination. This would not be swept away. Not this time. They rushed to the station, holding their daughter as if letting go might cause her to disappear. In their embrace, she finally allowed herself to cry, not from weakness, but from release. As night settled in, official statements were released. The officer was placed on immediate administrative leave pending investigation. The words sounded procedural, almost gentle, but everyone knew what they really meant. His career, once steady and unquestioned, now hung by a thread. Activists called for termination. Community leaders demanded accountability. Lawyers analyzed the footage frame by frame on television panels, explaining use of force policies and violations in calm, clinical voices that contrasted sharply with the raw emotion of the moment. The girl lay awake later that night, unable to sleep, replaying the slap over and over in her mind. Yet something else replayed too, the way strangers had spoken up, the way the supervisor had looked at her and said she did nothing wrong, the way the crowd refused to turn away. For the first time, she realized that fear didn't have to be the end of the story. What happened to her was wrong, deeply and undeniably wrong, but it had also cracked open a conversation the city could no longer ignore. And somewhere in that crack, fragile but real, was the possibility of change, born not from the officer's power, but from the courage of those who refused to stay silent. The following morning, the city woke up to the story everywhere, on television screens glowing in living rooms, on radios murmuring in kitchens, on phones buzzing relentlessly in pockets and purses. The video of the slap played on loop, slowed down, zoomed in, analyzed from every angle. Commentators paused at the exact moment the officer's hand connected with the girl's face, freezing the frame as if to force the world to look longer, harder, without flinching. Headlines spoke of excessive force, racial bias, and public outrage, but none of those phrases fully captured the weight of what people felt watching a grown man in uniform strike a child who posed no threat. The city's discomfort was palpable, a collective reckoning that settled in like a storm cloud refusing to move on. Protests formed by midday. They weren't violent or chaotic, but they were loud with purpose. People gathered outside the police department, holding signs painted hastily through the night. Justice for her. A badge is not a license to abuse. If it wasn't filmed, would it matter? The girl's name was spoken carefully, respectfully, as organizers reminded the crowd that this was about protecting her dignity, not exploiting her pain. She watched some of the footage from her bedroom, sitting beside her parents, feeling a strange mix of fear and empowerment. It was overwhelming to see strangers chanting for her, defending her, yet she couldn't shake the knowledge that it shouldn't have taken viral outrage for people to care. Still, care had arrived, and it was loud enough to shake the walls of institutions long used to silence. Inside the police department, the mood was tense and brittle. Officers whispered in hallways, conversations stopping abruptly when supervisors passed by. Emails from city officials demanded updates, timelines, accountability. Internal affairs moved quickly, pulling past complaints, reviewing performance records, interviewing colleagues who suddenly remembered things they had once dismissed as just his temper or one bad day. Patterns began to emerge, nothing dramatic enough on its own to end a career, but together they told a story of unchecked behavior and quiet tolerance. The slap was not an anomaly. It was an escalation caught on camera. The officer felt the walls closing in. At home, he sat alone at his kitchen table, the house unnaturally quiet. His uniform hung untouched in the closet, and for the first time in years, he had nowhere to be, no shift to report to, no authority to wield. Friends stopped answering his calls. Neighbors avoided eye contact. His name, once spoken with casual respect, was now attached to words like racist and abuser. He told himself it was unfair, that one mistake shouldn't erase decades of service. But deep down, a more uncomfortable truth surfaced. This wasn't just about the slap. It was about the way he had always seen people like her, and how easily that belief had turned into violence. Meanwhile, civil rights organizations reached out to the girl's family, offering legal support and counseling. Lawyers explained their options carefully, emphasizing that whatever path they chose, it would be on their terms. The girl listened quietly, absorbing the gravity of decisions no teenager should have to make. She didn't want revenge. She didn't want money. What she wanted was simple and impossibly large at the same time. She didn't want this to happen to anyone else. She wanted the fear she had felt on that sidewalk to end with her. At school, teachers spoke to students in hushed tones, trying to address the incident without re-traumatizing those who saw themselves in her story. Some classmates treated her like glass, afraid to say the wrong thing. Others hugged her fiercely, whispering words of support. A few stayed silent, unsure how to process the reality that authority figures meant to protect could also harm. The girl noticed everything, the kindness, the awkwardness, the avoidance, and it shaped her in quiet ways. She was no longer invisible. That visibility came with weight, but also with strength she hadn't known she possessed. As days passed, the pressure on the department intensified. City council members called for transparency. The mayor addressed the public, his voice strained as he acknowledged systemic issues that had been ignored for too long. Trust, he admitted, had been damaged. Rebuilding it would take more than statements and suspensions. The officer's fate loomed large in every conversation, his career hanging in limbo as investigators compiled their findings. Each new development pushed him further from the badge he once wore so confidently. For the girl, life began to settle into a new normal, though nothing felt quite the same. She still flinched when she heard sirens. She still replayed the slap in her mind when the world went quiet. But alongside the trauma grew something else, a sense of purpose, fragile but undeniable. She had been hurt publicly and unjustly, yet her pain had sparked a reckoning that could not be undone. One slap had revealed a truth too loud to ignore, and as the city stood at a crossroads between denial and change, it became clear that the story was far from over. The official announcement came late in the afternoon, delivered not with sirens or spectacle, but with a carefully worded press conference that nonetheless sent shockwaves through the city. The police chief stood behind the podium, shoulders stiff, eyes tired, and confirmed what many had already sensed was inevitable. The officer had been terminated effective immediately. Not suspended, not reassigned, fired. The words landed heavily, echoing through newsrooms and living rooms alike. The chief spoke of policy violations, of conduct unbecoming of an officer, of failure to uphold public trust. But between the lines was an admission far more powerful, that the system, for once, had been forced to look directly at itself and act. The badge that once shielded the officer was gone, stripped away not by internal loyalty, but by undeniable truth. The reaction was instant and electric. Some people cheered, seeing the decision as long overdue accountability. Others remained skeptical, questioning whether this was real change or simply a sacrifice meant to quiet the noise. On social media, the announcement trended within minutes, accompanied by heated debates, painful testimonies, and stories eerily similar to the girl's, stories that had never seen justice, never seen daylight. For many, the officer's firing was not an ending, but a symbol, a crack in a wall that had stood too firm for too long. It proved that consequences were possible, even if they were rare. For the officer himself, the moment was devastating in a way he had never imagined. Sitting alone in his living room, he watched the press conference on mute, reading the captions instead, as if silence might soften the blow. His career, built over decades, was reduced to a few sentences scrolling across the bottom of a screen. No ceremony, no farewell, just an abrupt end marked by public disgrace. He thought of the power he once held, how unquestioned it felt, how natural it seemed to assert control without reflection. Now, stripped of uniform and authority, he was forced to confront the truth he had long avoided. His actions were not isolated, and they were not justified. They were choices, ones that carried consequences he could no longer escape. Across the city, the girl and her family received the news quietly. There was no celebration in their home, no sense of victory. Instead, there was a deep, complicated stillness. Her mother exhaled slowly, relief and sorrow tangled together. Her father nodded once, as if acknowledging a hard truth finally spoken aloud. The girl sat with her knees pulled to her chest, listening, processing. Knowing the officer had lost his job did not erase the sting on her cheek or the fear that had taken root inside her. Justice, she realized, was not a magic undo button. It was necessary, but it was not healing on its own. In the days that followed, she was invited, carefully, respectfully, to speak at a community forum. She almost said no. The thought of standing in front of strangers, reliving the moment, felt unbearable. But then she remembered the sidewalk, the raised phones, the voices that refused to let the truth be buried. When she finally stood at the microphone, her hands shook, but her voice did not. She spoke about fear, about humiliation, about how powerless she felt in that instant. And then she spoke about something else, about the importance of being seen, of being believed, of knowing that silence only protects harm. The room listened in a way that felt different from before. Not reactive, intentional. Her words rippled outward. Training reviews were announced. Policy revisions were discussed openly. Body camera protocols were tightened. None of it promised perfection, but it signaled movement, and movement mattered. The girl became a name associated not just with an incident, but with courage. She never asked for that role, never wanted it. Yet she carried it with quiet strength, understanding that her voice now held weight for others who were still afraid to speak. As time passed, the video stopped trending, replaced by the next outrage, the next headline. That was the way of the world. But something fundamental had shifted, at least for those who paid attention. A line had been drawn, not just for one officer, but for a system that had too often relied on silence to survive. One slap, meant to assert dominance, had instead dismantled a career and ignited a conversation that could not be undone. For the girl, life slowly found a rhythm again. She returned to school, laughed with friends, dreamed about her future. The fear didn't disappear entirely, but it no longer owned her. She had learned, painfully and powerfully, that even the smallest voice could echo loudly when truth stood behind it. And though the cost had been high, her story became proof of something many had stopped believing. Accountability was possible, and sometimes, one moment was enough to change everything.